Started. Thanks everybody for being here. My name is Chris Winter. I'm the Executive Director of the Getches-Wilkinson Center for Natural Resources, Energy, and the Environment. It's such a pleasure to have everybody here with us tonight. Okay, is that working? Can you, a little bit better? All right, and I'll try to project a little bit more. Annie, right back here, has our programs. They showed up a little bit late from the printer, so we're sorry about that, but they're making their way around. So please grab a program. This evening's lecture is co-sponsored by the Center for the American West. And we're so excited to have Tommy Beaudreau, the former Deputy Secretary of the Interior, here with us this evening. So thank you, Tommy. And also I wanted to let you know that the Schultz Energy Lecture is made possible by the generosity of John H. and Cynthia H. Schultz. John Schultz graduated here from Colorado Law School in 1953 and went on to lead an impactful career as an oil and gas attorney working in Colorado and across the western United States. And Cynthia was a University of Colorado administrative staff member who worked for many chancellors here on campus. And she was also a member of the Graduate School Advisory Council and served the school in many other ways. So we're really grateful to be able to honor the legacy of John and Cynthia with this lecture series, which brings to the law school renowned scholars in energy and natural resources law to promote informed dialogue on emerging issues in the field. We're also thrilled to have Mike Howard here with us this evening. Welcome, Mike. Mike is a CU law grad from 2014 and is the grandson of John and Cynthia. So we're really grateful to have the Schultz-Howard family with us this evening. So in a minute, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Thomas Andrews, the director of the Center for the American West, who will introduce tonight's speaker. But before I do that, I wanted to touch on a couple of logistics for all of you. So after the lecture, we're going to have 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A. For that process, we're going to use a tool called Slido. And I don't know if any of you have used this before, but we're going to use it here tonight. It's really simple, and it gives everyone who is joining us online, and I think there's maybe 150 plus people who registered to join online tonight. It gives all of them an opportunity to submit questions along with all of you who are here with us in the room tonight. So it's going to be really easy. There's a QR code here in the room. Everybody who registered online, you should have gotten an email with a link. It's all web-based. You don't need to download an app or register or anything. You just go to the link. You can type in your questions. You can upvote other people's questions. And it's going to be a really easy and simple way for us to organize the dialogue. And then we're going to have Brooke Neely with the Center for the American West, who's going to help us moderate the Q&A with Tommy at the end. And I hope we can get to as many of your questions as possible. And thank you, Brooke, for helping us with that. After the lecture, please join us upstairs for some food and refreshments in Shading Commons, which is on the second floor of the law school. So we'll have about an hour, and we'll be able to continue the conversation upstairs. For all the law students in the room tonight, please be sure to join us tomorrow at noon in room 207. Tommy will be giving a lunch and learn there, and you'll have an opportunity to talk more with him about his career in natural resources law and to ask him some questions and advice on career ideas that you might have for yourself. And then finally, for everybody in the audience online and here in the room, please join us for GWC's next event, which is our annual conference on the Colorado River, which this year is named Turning Hindsight into Foresight, the Colorado River at a Crossroads. That conference is planned for June 5th and 6th here in the law school, and with all the attention that's focused right now on the Colorado River, I'm sure that's going to be a very interesting conversation. So please join us. As we gather for the lecture here tonight, I want to take a minute to honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado Law School is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now the state of Colorado and the University of Colorado at Boulder. As we get started with tonight's program, I just wanted to take a quick minute first to thank Tommy for joining us. So thank you, Tommy. Really appreciate your time. In his talk entitled The Lords of Yesterday and the Imperatives of Now, Tommy's going to discuss the ongoing transition to a clean energy economy and the role of America's public lands in those efforts. This, of course, is an especially important time for all of us to be having this conversation. The Biden administration, with the help of Tommy's leadership over the last several years, worked to accelerate the transition to a clean energy economy, to tackle climate change, and also to realize all of the additional benefits of clean renewable energy for the American public. That work required a delicate, sometimes messy balance of development, conservation, the rights of tribes and indigenous peoples across the West. It's difficult work, it's hard work, but there was a lot of progress over the last 4 years. Now, the new administration has declared a national energy emergency and has signaled that it intends to ramp up fossil fuel production and slow down the deployment of renewables. And this is even though the United States is already producing more oil and gas than any country ever has before in the history of the world, and the cost of renewables is cheaper or on par with fossil fuels for new sources of electricity. So this is an important time for us to be having this conversation. These dramatic swings in federal policy are built upon a legal framework that Professor Charles Wilkinson, of course an important figure here at the law school, talked about in his seminal 1992 book, Crossing the Next Meridian, Land, Water, and the Future of the American West. So Professor Wilkinson referred to these outdated laws and policies as the lords of yesterday and argued that they weren't up to the task of addressing the modern challenges ahead. And this was back in 1992. And at the end of his book, Professor Wilkinson underscores the importance of his thesis by noting the growing challenges presented by climate change, which he believed correctly would place additional stress on our outdated laws. So now, more than 30 years later, after publication of Crossing the Next Meridian, here we are. And I think it's fair to ask how far we've come and what lessons we've learned and where we go from here. And so I hope Tommy can help us think through some of those questions tonight together here in this room. So now I'd like to turn it over to Professor Thomas Andrews to introduce the rest of our panel and our guest. Professor Andrews is a professor of history at the University of Colorado and serves as the faculty director for the Center of the American West. His research and teaching focus on Western American environmental, animal, indigenous, and 19th and 20th century U.S. history. He has a wealth of knowledge and expertise to share with all of you tonight, and he and his team have been wonderful partners also in organizing this event. So welcome, Thomas, and thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. I want to give all of you a huge thanks for taking the time to join us this evening. I'm incredibly grateful that so many of you have seen fit to take time from your busy schedules and on a day that at least started out so beautifully to learn more about our ever-embattled public lands. Events such as tonight's take a lot of work, and I want to let everyone here know just how much thought, care, time, and energy Chris Winter and Annie Carlozzi of the law school's Getches-Wilkinson Center, as well as the Center of the American West's Tamara McKee, have devoted to planning, preparing, and pulling off this lecture. Two other esteemed CAW colleagues, Brooke Neely and Ryan Lewick, have also played instrumental roles in tonight's event, as have many, many others at the law school. I also want to thank the Schultz family for funding Tommy's lecture tonight, including the reception that will follow the question and answer session. I also want to thank the Tim and Ren Worth Foundation for helping to support other parts of Tommy's visit to CU Boulder. And I also want to thank Wilmer Hale for helping us get Tommy out here and for sharing Tommy with us during his visit. So thank you, everyone. I can't say enough good things about how wonderful it has been to collaborate with the Getches-Wilkinson Center. In all sorts of ways, this has felt like a natural fit, and for good reason. Charles Wilkinson, after all, played a pivotal part in the Center of the American West's early years. And so in many ways, I think of tonight's event as bringing us full circle. I'm looking forward to many fruitful collaborations in the years to come between these two robust centers, each of which is carrying forth in its own way Professor Wilkinson's deeply inspiring commitments to publicly engaged research, teaching, mentoring, and outreach. Goodness knows that many of the problems that Charles Wilkinson devoted his career to elucidating and trying to resolve are unfortunately with us still. Sadly, the thorny and far-reaching challenges facing the West, not to mention those facing the nation and the wider world, only seem to be growing in scale and scope and intensity as we enter the second quarter of the 21st century. Sorry for the uplifting introduction. Our speaker tonight has spent his career fighting on the front lines and, no less important, toiling backstage in many of the most contentious conflicts that have faced the West in the last few decades. But rather than recite Tommy's resume, as impressive as it is, I want to offer a more personal introduction for a man I've always looked up to and perhaps even idolized a little. You see, Tommy Beaudreau was the first friend I made in college. I was born just up Broadway from here. I went to high school on the other end of town at Fairview. I was a faculty brat, and like many kids who grew up in this campus's shadow, I desperately wanted to get as far away from here as I could. Having grown up in an academic family in Boulder during the 1970s and 1980s, I was woefully out of my depth when I arrived on the Yale campus as a fresh-faced 18-year-old in 1990. Tommy was the first friend I made in New Haven. We'd already corresponded once or twice over the summer after being matched as roommates in a 6-person suite. Once on campus, we became fast friends. For most of that first semester, we were practically inseparable. Before long, we became known as TNT, and every time I say TNT, you should imagine, this theme song playing in the background. That's kind of how it felt, What drew us together? First and foremost, Tommy and I were both Westerners, although I, at least, had little idea how much that already meant to me, nor did I have much of a sense of of the even greater meaning that would come to hold for me, and I think also for Tommy in the decades that followed. Although Tommy had spent much of his life in Alaska, chiefly in Anchorage, he too was Colorado-born. We also shared a love for soccer and devoted many memorable afternoons to skirmishing on the intramural soccer fields with our fellow Jonathan Edwards College Spiders. And not least, we both decided to major in history. I don't remember talking over that decision or, the decision that either one of us made to do that, but my strong sense is that we both recognized that the study of the past provided one of the most powerful tools that we could possibly have in our effort to understand the present, as well as to shape the future. A lot of what I liked about Tommy, though, undoubtedly stemmed from our differences. I was raised by a quaternary geomorphologist and a research librarian on the mean streets of Boulder. Tommy, meanwhile, was raised in Alaska. This meant that he was tough in a way that I never was or never could become. In high school, for instance, I had to navigate deer grazing on Table Mesa's lawns. Tommy, meanwhile, blew my mind when he told me the story of how he had totaled the car as a high schooler by crashing into a moose. These days you can total your car on a moose in Colorado, but that was unheard of back when I was growing up. Tommy's family also ran in different circles than mine, as another story Tommy shared with me in the early days of our friendship drives home. Tommy's dad, who had come to Alaska to work in the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, was working on the Colorado County Fair horse racing circuit back in the early 1970s, when a testy horse kicked him in the midsection and sent him to a Wheat Ridge hospital. As fate would have it, Tommy's mom was already in the maternity ward of that same hospital, giving birth to Tommy. When his dad's friends visited to congratulate the new parents, they arrived with a scheme already brewing. Tommy is not short for Thomas. Instead, it was the first name of the beast whose hooves landed Tommy's dad in the hospital. That horse was named Tommy Port, hence Tommy P. Beaudreau. After freshman year, Tommy and I drifted a little apart, but we've always remained very good friends. As the years stretched into decades, we stayed in touch. Although I don't see him that often, I always love spending time with the guy, as I'm sure you will too. From afar, I've watched Tommy's illustrious career unfold with pride, admiration, envy, and even awe. After graduating from Yale with a degree in history, Tommy studied law at Georgetown. After working at Fried Frank, doing a clerkship, getting married, starting a family, he eventually made his way into 2 long stints of significant government service. The first under Colorado's Ken Salazar, Washington's Sally Jewell, and President Barack Obama. That included establishing and running the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And then he would go on to a second stint as Deputy Secretary of the Interior under Deb Haaland and Joe Biden. To me, Tommy's turn from private practice to public service made perfect sense. Many of the things I had loved about Tommy when we first met, after all, pointed in exactly this direction. First, he always had an unshakable commitment to doing the right thing. Second, he had a prodigious capacity for tireless and selfless work. And third, Tommy has always been devoted to protecting public lands, enhancing tribal sovereignty, advancing indigenous self-determination, ensuring a more equitable distribution of American abundance, bringing about just energy transitions, and so on and so on. So as we stand on the threshold of an uncertain and frightening future, Tommy is going to give us the benefit of his expertise, his experience, and his insight as an attorney, a government official, an historian, and not least, a Westerner through and through. So without further ado, I give you my dear friend and this year's Schultz's Energy Lecturer, Tommy Port Beaudreau. Here.
So that's it for tonight. Got the, thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas, and thank you so much, Chris. And huge thank you to everybody who helped pull this evening together. I really, really appreciate it, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you in Colorado today and get a break from Washington, D.C., where I live. And thank you, Thomas, for the embarrassing introduction. It is true. So in our 6-person suite, there is me. I was one of a couple kids from Alaska in our class. I had never been to New Haven before. There wasn't like college, like scouting trips. And so I arrived in New Haven, and let's just say it was different than I expected or imagined. But the first guy I got to meet was Thomas from Colorado, and another roommate, and the guy I shared a double with in our 6-person suite was from Bozeman. And so I thought, this is incredible that Yale would be so thoughtful that they would, group us together in this way, and, some Westerners who could help each other out and get through any culture shock, which I think maybe was true, but I also came to realize they were also isolating and containing the problem in case it ever got out of control. They could just, segregate it and move it if they needed to. And the other important takeaway from all of that is you develop these friendships along the way, and many of you are students, either undergrad or law school or graduate school. You really got to be careful about those, because you never know what it's going to lead to, and you're going to end up having to stand in front of a bunch of people in a symposium someday. So just watch yourselves. So again, thank you, and thanks for coming out tonight. It is a gorgeous Colorado day, and it's a Tuesday, and there's lots of other things folks could be doing, so I really do appreciate you spending time with me and with us. Chris introduced and set the stage perfectly. The title of this discussion tonight is, the Lords of Yesterday and the Imperatives of Now, which intentionally harkens to Charles Wilkinson's seminal work, the next meridian, crossing the next meridian, land, water, and the future of the American West. And I was really glad to hear that Tamar still maintains that text as required reading in her course as she trains the next generation of historians focused on the American West. And it was a seminal work for me as well, and something that in the different steps in my career I've often gone back to, as we do with important works of literature in history. And so Charles wrote about the American West's, quote, pattern of cultural reliance on natural resources, end quote. And he also wrote about the ironies of the West, the tension between beauty and consumption, political conservatism and notions of freedom paired with a dependency on those natural resources and policies that subsidize that dependency. And I'll just say, that very much was part of my experience growing up. As Thomas said, I grew up in Alaska. My father, who was a Marine, got a great job working on the North Slope after the Trans-Alaska Pipeline came online, and moved our family up for our Alaskan adventure. And I benefited enormously from that childhood of spending time in the outdoors, hunting and fishing and skiing and backpacking, and doing everything that Alaskans and Westerners love about where they live. I was a junior in high school when the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened, and it brought into very painful relief our dependency on this product that so directly impacted and damaged the place I love. And if you've ever been, Alaska's great, it's beautiful, it has lots of different landscapes. Prince William Sound, where the Exxon Valdez ran aground, is truly, in my biased view, the most beautiful place on Earth. And so even the 17-year-old me saw that and appreciated, even though I wasn't able to articulate it quite as well back then, appreciated this irony of being an Alaskan who so deeply enjoyed and loved the beauty and natural abundance of that place, but was both my family and the society there completely dependent on this product that had the potential to destroy it. And that is also the story of the United States and the American West, as Charles lays out in his book. Homesteading, the railroad grants, mining laws are all examples of 19th century policy to support and incentivize westward expansion. And that's, the term we used when we were studying this. There's other, probably more accurate ways to describe it in terms of manifest destiny, colonial settlers, and even worse. And we know the cost of that westward expansion, especially on indigenous people and tribes, and to the environment, in the forests and grasslands, salmon, bison, everything that has at one time seemed limitless and inexhaustible, and we've learned that they weren't so. And so Charles acknowledges and laments those costs, but his purpose wasn't to evaluate the merits of manifest destiny or the policies of the 19th century. Rather, he writes that even if you assume that, quote, the 19th century programs may have been right for their own time, that does not settle the question of whether it's right for these times. Charles wrote invaluable analysis on these 5 lords of yesterday that Chris talked about, that, quote, fit the needs of the frontier West, but are radical and extreme in the modern light. And these lords of yesterday, in Charles's words, exemplify public policy at a moment and a place where there seemed to be no end to the nature's ability to produce still more material goods with few negative consequences. And the lords of yesterday that Charles uses as his examples are the 1872 mining law, which I'll talk a little bit about because of its pertinence to energy transition, and the law and policy governing grazing, forests, dams, and water rights. So Charles, as Chris pointed out, Charles published this book in 1992. And that was while he had the foresight to see what was coming in terms of climate. It wasn't the type of organizing principle in terms of policy priority that it is now. The overriding concerns that the question of energy transition motivates and shapes, the priorities and policy imperatives of today, including in the administrations that I was part of. And so in some ways, the metaphorical next meridian that Charles wrote about has shifted again, and in some ways feels even more dire than the problems that we appeared to be confronting in the early 90s. And so we're still concerned, of course, about unsustainable consumption and degradation of Western ecosystems and wildlife habitat, our grasslands, forests, watersheds, and the critters and people that it all supports. But on top of those concerns are the truly existential threats that climate change presents for all of that. And so these 21st century policy imperatives are with us and in our face right now, and yet these same lords of yesterday seek to rule us and frustrate us. Among the issues we worked on in earnest during the Biden administration was, Colorado River, and Chris, talked about the upcoming gatherings to continue to think through sustainable management of that system. The pithiest summary of our challenges that I ever heard was from the head of the Nevada State Water Authority, who said, the fundamental challenge with the Colorado River system is that we have 19th century law, 20th century infrastructure, and 21st century climate. And that, in my mind, brings together these very challenges around the lords of yesterday and what we're faced with to try to do something about it today. And so that's what the focus of my discussion tonight is about, is those obstacles that stand between us and crossing that meridian of energy transition and coping with climate change, at least as relates specifically to public lands policy. Obviously, there's a host of issues that go even further afield than what we're concerned about tonight. And so, put another way, and this is the way I think about it, and I'm just going to let you know that a lot of my talk is not like super optimistic, and so and part of the reason for that is I have spent the better part of 2 administrations and the interim administration trying to wrestle with these issues of energy transition and what do we have to solve for in order to get there, and looking my children in the face, who are college students themselves and have expectations for their father in advancing sound policy, looking them in the face to say, like, why hasn't it happened yet? And the crisis is there. We know about it. The science is clear. Why haven't we made further progress on energy transition? And so as somebody who, like you, is a serious person in this field, I've reflected on what those barriers are and what those challenges are, and the straight up things that we have to confront if we're to again try to cross that meridian that Charles talked about. So in broad strokes, the 4 challenges I want to talk a little bit about and just sort of scope them. And then I will say, at the end, like some of the things I think we can do about it. So it's not all, issue spotting. The first is structural social issues, especially here in the West, that are real barriers to energy transition. The second are the legal issues in our set of laws that Charles talks about as the Lords of yesterday still governing us. Third are economic considerations, which very directly flow into the politics. And finally, and I won't spend much time on this one, just because, again, it gets us a little far afield from public lands. The last one are just sort of geopolitical realities that that we have to contend with. And so the first of these challenges that I think we have to be honest in diagnosing are the political and social structures that that have taken shape in this country over a period of 150 years. And so as an initial matter, like, what is it about public lands that is so front and center in those debates? I will just say, based on my experience in government, public lands are useful political proxies for a lot of this debate, right? And so the unprecedented domestic energy production that fossil fuel production that Chris talked about, that's true. That is largely driven, however, by the shale revolution that is outside of public lands. It's on state and private lands, including in the Southwest and North Dakota. And yet, we still talk about public lands as if, on both sides of that ledger, they are the make or break on energy transition. And in Democratic administrations I served in, that was a useful way to talk about it because, the administration had control, policy control, administrative control over public lands. And so could say things like, we're gonna, stop leasing on public lands. And then the opposite happens in Republican administrations in the current administration, where they talk about, we're going to unleash American industry by opening up public lands and bringing back energy dominance by using public lands. And the truth is, like, neither of those is really true. Like, you're not going to do either of those things through public lands policy. You can wreck a lot of public lands along the way, but you're not going to flip a switch on energy transition either way through public lands. And I'll just make a side note on the energy dominance rhetoric. I do, and this is, I don't presume other people's politics. You guys can guess what mine are. I don't totally get it. On one level, I understand the idea that the United States can use its natural resource abundance to dictate policy or whatever. But, also in my experience, people don't like being dominated by energy companies. And so I never really understood, when I see the current DOI people stand up and talk about energy dominance, I was sort of like, you gotta, think about your audience here, because in the West, people know what that means, and they know what it means to have so much of what they care about tied to and dominated by fossil fuel production. And so as you look at these social structures and in the context of what you can do about it on public lands, there's also the reality that all of you in this room know, but many policymakers in Washington, D.C. don't fully grasp, is how intertwined and embedded fossil fuel development is with our society and the way our governments fund themselves and provide fundamental public services, including education, public safety, roads and infrastructure. And so it is a hard proposition to go out to the American West and Alaska and say, like, we're going to do an energy transition and not have an answer for that question of, like, okay, how is our state budget going to fund itself? And how are we going to fund conservation programs like the Land and Water Conservation Fund? And until we have the ability to provide an answer for that, the politics are never going to yield to energy transition. Like, how do you look a community in the face and say, have we got a great deal for you? We're going to, go through an energy transition, and these royalty revenues that literally form your budget. We'll figure. We don't quite have an answer for that yet. So that is, in my mind, the number one barrier in the United States to really disentangling ourselves from fossil fuels, is having that answer for all of the ways in which this type of resource development has permeated and embedded itself in our fundamental structures. And that manifests itself in a lot of different ways, including, again, in Washington, D.C., and we talked a little bit about this during, our lunch today that I was fortunate to be able to have with members of and students in the history department. Again, a lot of people in Washington, D.C. think about these problems in monolithic ways, including how tribes feel about fossil fuel development and, like, the assumption that tribes must be opposed to, degradation of resources and that sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, of course, Native American people are concerned about those issues, but they also are like any other community. First of all, they're a political entity, tribes are. And second, they've got the same fundamental economic considerations for their communities that every community does. And many tribes, because it's what they have been, had available to them, are, tied to fossil fuel development too. And so, Secretary Burgum, Governor Burgum, who's at the Interior Department now, it is true, he has a very good relationship with North Dakota tribes, and including places like Fort Berthold, and that's because there was sort of some commonality of interest in his policy and Fort Berthold's way of providing services to that tribe and tribal members. And so this, again, Chaco is like a great example. This administration, Secretary Holland, took measures finally to protect Chaco Canyon and the historical and cultural resources there from encroachment of oil and gas leasing, but it caused controversy, including with Navajo, who have allotments in that area, and questions about the impacts of that. And so I just highlight that as example of what I think of in terms of not just energy transition, but just transition. How do we not leave people behind? How do we make them part of a future in light of a transition that they didn't really have any choice about and were made dependent on? Second, well, actually, before I go there, and it's even worse on critical minerals, right? And Professor Squillace has spent a lot of time on this issue, where you have hard rock mining, which in the 1872 mining law, which is like the greatest, in the sense of worst, example of this kind of 19th century policy to drive settlement in the West, westward expansion, and provide economies and economic opportunity to the new states. It's, in the Biden administration, which was focused on energy transition, folks knew that energy transition required critical minerals development, right? Like folks knew that was going to be a choke point, including how to break free of China's control on critical minerals sourcing and processing. And so, they haul in the Deputy Secretary of the Interior Department, and they're like, why can't you permit more mines? We need this stuff. And so I developed an entire stand-up routine about the 1872 mining law that I would perform in these White House meetings. And it was great material because it is so absurd, right? So whatever else you think about policy, and one of my lines in this routine was, I'm not saying we need to rewrite the nation's mining laws every century, but every other century we should take a look and see if they're meeting the imperatives of now. And so, the Grant administration had a set of its policy priorities. The 21st century priorities are different. And there's lots of problems with our mining laws, but one that goes to the point I was trying to make is, the simple proposition of what's in it for communities. And so communities, and this is part of what I tried to explain to the White House as well, is, the context, the context for our mining laws is one of theft and displacement, right? The prospecting statutes. Indigenous people bore the brunt of that. So getting moved off of areas that, back then it was like gold rushes and all of this stuff. And then, suffering environmental degradation, but not seeing any benefit from it, including even indirectly through royalty payments into the federal government. And so the White House, again, folks who were learning this stuff but hadn't been steeped in it, I was like, they don't pay royalty, on hard rock mineral development. And they were like, what? And I was like, no, they don't, to this day. And so that's got to be part of the value proposition too of, for communities and particularly tribes who, whenever there's a new mining development, bring that painful history into the conversation. There has to be some discussion about how we move past that and address the question of, what's in it, for those communities and what's in it for them. And that's brought even more to the fore because of energy transition. And so, all of these questions about fossil fuels and the impacts, in some ways, energy transition brings that same set of issues to the front on materials we need for energy transition, which, again, I think is something that Charles Wilkinson would have appreciated the irony of. And that's, a big part of the conversation around, the second point of what are our, structural problems. And Charles spent a lot of time in his book talking about the legal, this kind of second barrier, these legal barriers, our ancient statutory frameworks, the 1872 mining law being, again, just the most cartoonish one that brings it home. But it's also true on lease rights and oil and gas rights. And so we were talking a little bit today about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and, the politics around it and what it was like, in 2010 dealing with that. And Ann was there. So we have, in my view, the greatest environmental calamity in U.S. history, and you can argue about the oil budget, but, 5 billion barrels of oil dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. And Secretary Salazar at that time did what I thought was quite a sensible thing, and imposed a moratorium, not on production, but on new exploration drilling while, the Macondo well was still flowing. It took 89 days, remember, to get a capping stack to plug that well. And so here, the state of Louisiana and the Gulf states are experiencing this unprecedented environmental catastrophe, and we're still in the well is still flowing, the containment vessels are still out there, and they're mobilizing to push back on the moratorium because of the fear of the economic consequences of stopping the machine. And so that was a stark lesson for me of like, here I am, I think I'm, helping, and we're trying to stop the well. And the real concern we're hearing from the politicians was, you're bringing an economic catastrophe to Louisiana and the Gulf Coast through this moratorium. And going to the lease rights point, they began to sue, right? And so they would bring, the companies in the states would bring these lawsuits, and their argument was, we have lease rights. We have the right to, as long as we comply with your regulations, we have the right to drill and develop under our leases. And if BP screwed up, that's BP's fault. You have all the authority you need to punish BP, but we haven't screwed up. And so what is the basis for you to stop us from enjoying our statutory and contractual rights under our leases? And you know what? Like, courts bought that. They were like, you're right, you do have those rights. And so here we are in the middle of this catastrophe, and courts are ruling like, you got to get on with business. And so talk about a Lord of yesterday. It's like, we've got a real problem in front of us now. And, these laws constrained us from being able to deal with it. And, on that point, again, just because it's a great example that brings it home, I did think, I joined the department in 2010 to help with, Secretary Salazar to help with the oil spill and reforms coming out of it. And it was like my second day being in the department, and, we had the moratorium in place, and I didn't even know, I had a phone, I didn't know what the number for it was, but the then Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana got that number, and he called it, and I picked up, and he goes, and I'm going to try to do the accent, but he goes, hey, this is and he's a friend of mine now, actually, and so I've told this story in front of him. He's like, hey, this is Scott Angel, I'm, Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, and I don't know why someone named Beaudreau hate Louisiana so much. And so I was like, well, sir, I assure you I'm here to help and stuff. But again, in those lessons, it was like, okay, it started registering with me of some of the realities around, even in the context of environmental disaster, how hard it's going to be to transition away from oil and gas and fossil fuels. So third, the economics, which again, I think flow right into the politics. And this is a big part of what we're seeing today on the attacks on renewable energy. And so this administration so far is a little bit different, right? It wasn't, in the past, it was like, all right, we're here, we're go on fossil fuels, and they are that. But they're also like, they're not all of the above, right? At least they're signaling it's like we're going to affirmatively challenge renewable energy and approach, energy transition in that way. And so, and you can ask yourself, why? Why would they feel that way? And we can, maybe talk a little bit about my theories on that. But one of them is, for wind in particular and offshore wind in particular, it translates into a lot of their political and policy arguments, really nicely on some levels. It's, there's a story to be told, and I think there's, just some kernels in there, but a lot of falsehoods too, but enough kernels that they're like, look, offshore wind, it's an example of the, drunken Biden administration, hoping for fairy dust and spending billions of dollars on a technology that is too expensive. We have less expensive alternatives, natural gas in particular, and that's what's driving inflation, and that's harming, your pocketbook. And so, the affordability argument and the argument around, state subsidies and how much subsidization renewable energy requires, and again, why would we subsidize, energy when we have such abundance on the fossil fuel side? And how can that be justified? And how can, these silly blue states, burden taxpayers and ratepayers to subsidize a technology like offshore wind when all you have to do is just plug in, the gas line, and life will get better quickly. And they're also, wind energy in general, and offshore wind plays into some very powerful, politics around nostalgia for certain industries. And so that's why, on offshore wind, fishing interests are kind of at the fore, right? So, and concerns about the impacts of, offshore wind on traditional economies. And so out west, we have a lot of traditional economies with, ranching and agriculture. And in New England, people think about their culture and their character and their history. The fishing industry plays a huge part in that. And so regardless how many people it actually employs today, that's a potent set of politics that opponents of renewable energy have, found useful to harness. And so those, those economic arguments around affordability and et cetera are things that, we have, if you're serious about energy transition, you have to face up to. Just one quick side point on the subsidy question. Everybody in this room knows that and again, taking Charles's lead here, this isn't a question of whether historical policy was right or wrong, but nobody can argue that the fossil fuel industry hasn't been substantially subsidized in lots of different ways. And the most, starkest example is, again, in the offshore. In the 90s, there was policy consensus that the United States should promote technology to develop in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico. And so, these drilling platforms and production platforms in, water sometimes more than a mile deep. And there was policy consensus that the way to do that was royalty relief, and that providing the offshore oil and gas industry a break on paying royalties would make that technology economic and doable. And it sure did. And there are royalty-free barrels of oil being produced in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico today. And so, again, for me, the arguments about, subsidy and, the attack on renewable energy in that way ring a little hollow. And finally, before we kind of open up the discussion, the geopolitics. And as I said, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but, this is one of the big themes in energy dominance, right, is, exporting now LNG and supplying Europe and supplying different parts of the world, and using that as not only a national security measure, but as a real foreign policy lever. And that is juxtaposed these days with China's chokehold on critical minerals sourcing and especially processing, and the materials necessary for renewable energy development and grid expansion and high-tech manufacturing. And so it's interesting to see how that geopolitics has kind of shaped the way people talk about fossil fuels, which we all grew up thinking about, dependency on the Middle East and, how much havoc that wreaks with our policy. And what you're seeing now in this administration is the argument that fossil fuels has geopolitical advantages for us in a way that renewable energy and the materials necessary for renewable energy and energy transition actually plays into the hands of our adversaries, in particular China. And so those are big problems. So a couple thoughts on the path to crossing that meridian. One, I do think the policy and the legislative achievements through things like the Inflation Reduction Act were a big step in the right direction, hitting the demand side in our economy. A lot of the public lands discussion is about the supply side, like should we be producing on public lands or leasing on public lands, and that runs into all of the problems that you guys know about and we've talked about. But an energy transition that is driven by investments on the demand side, I think holds a lot of promise. It reduces the need for fossil fuels as a commodity. And that has the potential to change the way we think about the highest and best uses of our public lands. Second, and we touched on it a little bit, what does a just transition for Western communities and tribes look like? And in my mind, that has to mean, and I work with a lot of renewable energy companies, and I put it to them, I'm like, what is your value proposition, right? Like, how are you going to fill that void that an energy transition would leave in terms of, economics and government services? And so I do think there has to be a conversation about how revenues with clean energy development and mineral development work. I think, part of that conversation, and again, there's political barriers to this, is, around how to diversify economies and state budgets and how to use, ongoing revenues generated by fossil fuels to reinvest into communities to facilitate that diversification. And then the last point I want to raise, which is really, like, for me, the hopeful point, especially when I was deputy secretary, I'll just say, and we talked a little bit about this at lunch today too, I had a lot of Western, very conservative landowners come into my office, and these were not Biden voters, and talk in very stark terms about their concerns about what they were seeing on the landscapes. And these are people who, and again, there's a whole history, here that, we're always cognizant of, but, these are people who, as Western landowners and ranchers, et cetera, in their hearts, truly viewed themselves as stewards of the land and viewed themselves as part of a tradition that they wanted to pass on to their families and their children that included access to the outdoors, just like I enjoyed when I was a kid, included wildlife migration and corridors and seeing antelope on their lands, and very troubled about what they were seeing in places like Idaho and Wyoming and Montana of, the wrong kind of Californians moving in and blocking all of that and not coming to these Western states with the same sensibility. And in my mind, that actually opens up a big opportunity for conservation, and that there's actual consensus and common ground on a lot of these issues. And the question is, how do you approach them, and how do you, meet people where they are and channel those shared interests in conservation and stewardship and preservation of resources for future generations. And the fact that in our current political circumstance, a lot of what is most troubling is being driven by, again, in my mind, the wrong kind of Californian. And there will be backlash to that. And the question from a conservation perspective is whether we can harness and channel that backlash and bring it within a broader coalition in support of some traditional values on public lands and conservation and wildlife habitat. And so these are, and again, my politics, not everybody, there's, I respect, lots of points of view, but my politics, it's like I'm seeking for those types of opportunities of how do we engage and how do we bring communities in on those types of shared values. And this has always been one of Charles's fundamental insights. And, one of my mentors, John Leshy, who wrote a book literally called Our Common Ground, on how public lands can do that for us. And so lots of challenges. I do, as you can tell, harbor some pessimism on certain issues, but on that issue and the ability of public lands to be that literal and figurative common ground for us, I actually hold a fair amount of optimism. So thank you for listening to all of that. And again, thank you so much for coming out tonight, and thanks everyone who tuned in, and it would be really great to do some questions.
Okay, we have a number of questions. A bunch of people are curious about a sort of pessimistic topic, which is the recent firings in a number of public land agencies. So some folks are interested in the general impacts at a place like the Department of the Interior. We have a specific question about U.S. Forest Service and potential impacts on things like wildfire mitigation, illegal timber removal, and the spread of invasive species. So maybe you could speak generally and then more specifically.
So again, there are some things about this administration that are different. And this, and again, my views, this very aggressive and destructive approach to the civil service is, I think for a lot of us, incredibly jarring and worrisome and troublesome, let alone for the families of public servants and our friends who are directly impacted by it. And, many of you have served in federal or state or local government. One of the just, perplexing and hard things to deal with in all of this with, the career staff is, they could, many of them, almost all of them, take enormous pride in being public servants and working at the Interior Department or working at the Forest Service, and view it as like this calling and truly honorable undertaking that they've devoted themselves to. And so in addition to just, the firing and all of that, just the being vilified for what, we've all viewed, and they certainly identify as being engaged in a virtuous endeavor in support of their country and their fellow Americans, is an incredibly hard thing to get your head around. In terms of the impacts of it, again, having been in the department as long as I have, there's not a lot of fat in the department. Anyone who's gone to a park or National Wildlife Refuge knows that they're not staffed properly, and the challenges that presents for the mission, which was given to them by Congress, as well as the protection of, shared resources. And so there will be degradation. It's like there's no way there couldn't be. And then, it doesn't bode well for a lot of communities, and the economics and structure of those communities. So the front page of, the Montana paper in Whitefish last Monday was, 370 U.S. Forest Service jobs gone. Again, anyone who spent time in Whitefish, that's not, the liberal bastion, but they know what those jobs are and that it is not possible actually for a community like that to replace those jobs. And so those people in all of the grocery stores and everything that they contribute to are going to suffer. And so that's on the, economic side. And then, it's literally playing with fire. On the one hand, this rhetoric about, the administration, not doing enough to prevent wildfire and raking forests and stuff. And yet, that personnel and the infrastructure necessary to deal with a year-round fire season now is being gutted and demoralized. So there will be consequences. I think there's, no two ways about that.
Thank you. We have a few questions related to water management. One is, how does the law of prior appropriation affect contemporary water disputes, especially in the context of climate change and the competition for water resources? Another person is curious about where the fight and negotiations over the river will go and whether it might end up in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So Charles, and I didn't spend as much time on it, but one of the big lords of yesterday is that doctrine, right? And that has been fundamental to the way Western communities have organized themselves around water rights and water usage. And it is true that that is one of the lords of yesterday that constrain our ability to not only just manage for 21st century cities and populations, but all of the stress put on the system by sustained drought. And so again, being saddled with 19th century law for 21st century climate is a fundamental challenge. As for, the Colorado River negotiations, and as everybody knows, in this area, the current guidelines, do expire in 2026. My personal feeling is that the Interior Department, at the end of the Biden administration, laid out some pretty clear paths that can help the formation of those guidelines and provide for a more sustainable future in terms of all of the services provided by the Colorado River system. And just as folks are worried about, the new administration and, what policies will come out of it, we'll see. So far, I've seen a lot of canceled meetings, and, that sort of thing, which adds to some of the worry. All that said, there are very experienced people in this field. There are states who, in the lower and upper basin, who have been focused on these issues and know the stakes, and certainly have a lot of these issues within their control. And so there are people who will always work in good faith in the interests of the 40 million people who depend on that system. And so, I have, I have some belief that, we can, look to those folks to plot out a more sustainable future for the Colorado River.
There are a number of people interested in how you manage to reach across political divides in the work that you did, or the whole range of perspectives on these kinds of debates. So can you speak a little bit to how you approached bipartisanship or even multi-partisanship in the work you did?
And we touch on it, at the outset, and I think it's been a theme of the conversation tonight is, there is, and again, there's a whole range of political perspective and, what people of good faith think is right for this country. But one of the things that I've drawn upon in the roles I've played is, my upbringing in the West, where, among other things, there is a tradition of, trying to understand your neighbor, trying to meet people where they are, and approaching those issues, in good faith. And, to the extent I, had any success in those roles, it was, drawing upon, that upbringing and those traditions and being honest with people. Like, that gets you a long way, actually. Like, even when especially when you're, talking with them about things that, they'd be opposed to or don't like or don't understand, like being straight with people and telling everybody the exact same thing, whether they're, on the NGO side, on the state government side, landowners, industry, saying the same thing to everybody, allows you to be at all of those tables. And so while, I can be criticized sometimes by folks who think like, oh, like, why aren't you on this team? Or, why aren't you, more, committed on, this point of view or whatever. Part of my priority has always been to make sure that I am at as many tables as possible to have those conversations. And so, and that's in government. It's also, for what it's worth, my 2 cents on, going about life in these circumstances. And we talked a little bit at the lunch today. I also think that's a real key to how we get through this, right? There are forces at the ends of the spectrum who want to push us into corners, want to isolate us, want to have us view the other team as the enemy. And they do that because, like, it provides political energy, among other things. And one of the ways, we talked about at the lunch today of getting through all of that and maintaining your sanity is really like working at trying to understand what's going on and trying to be more engaged and not less engaged. And so those are principles that, I was trained on and served me well in my government service, and I think have application for, for us as individuals now too.
A number of people, excuse me, are interested in this question. It's a little provocative. If you could have a do-over on your approach to energy development on public lands, what would you change, especially knowing Trump would pursue deregulation?
Awesome question. And, I think part of what we are seeing in, at least in the early days of this administration, not only on the deregulation front, but this kind of aggressive posture towards renewable energy. I think there's a little quality of a lot of the policy tools and legal tools that have been used in the past to oppose and block fossil fuel projects, some of which I championed and made use of, are now being turned against energy transition. And so, while I say like, oh, I have regrets about X, Y, and Z, not necessarily, because you do things in a context, but I do see authorities that, again, at different points in my career in government, I made aggressive use of that are being, used in ways that aren't positive. And so, I make this joke sometimes about some of those tools of like, this is why we can't have nice things, because they can be turned against you. And I think, without getting into specifics, I think there's a couple examples of that happening already.
What does it mean to invest in the demand side of renewable energy?
Yeah, so, and this is, again, as I talked about, part of what I thought, for an administration like the Biden administration that really brought climate as one of its principal organizing policy goals, I think we've all seen examples of, debates around, supply and leasing and whether, we should, permit, new oil and gas and those sorts of things. And as I said, appreciate all of that and definitely think, responsible public lands management requires, serious thought about priorities and where extractive activities fit into all of that. It does run you headlong into these problems. And so if you are serious about energy transition, I think an approach that focuses on relieving the appetite for and need for fossil fuels by electrifying transportation, electrifying power generation, or decarbonizing power generation. Like, those are things that seem to me can work, right? Because it brings economics and just the realities of economics, have them work for you instead of against you. And so, we'll see. I think, some people are like, well, what's going to happen with, some of the IRA investments, and are they all going to go away? And I actually don't think they will, but I think, there will be some rollbacks.
This is a question from a Colorado law, or soon-to-be Colorado law graduate. What's a young person to do about the lords of yesterday? What experience do we need before we confront the beasts?
And Chris and I were just talking about this. Truly, stick with it. For folks coming through law school now who want to be involved in professionally public lands and natural resources and energy transition issues, I can imagine how worrisome, the current environment is. I know, there are recent law grads who were fixing to go to Department of Justice who had, their honors program offers rescinded. There's, it's easy for me to say, but truly, don't be discouraged. Part of what is terrific about this area of law, and, it goes back to, Charles, it's, that next meridian, you're never actually there. And so that's part of what is cool about this field of law is it's eternally engaging, and the problems are, because they're significant and they matter to a lot of people, are never really solved. And the challenges that you saw in 1992 are, different even, just 20 years later. And so it is a field of law that is worthwhile for those reasons, in my view, of one, relevance to it's one of the top 5 issues you can be involved in. And 2, it never gets old for those reasons. And, again, I love the meridian metaphor because, if you are on a globe, like it just, you never get there. And I think that's true about this area.
Okay, we've got one last question, and we have a couple different questions about how tribal nations and indigenous communities are impacted by various policy changes and all the things you've talked about. So if you could end on just a bit of a discussion on where that stands at the moment, and granted there's transition, but just the potential implications for tribal communities.
So for me, I think the most fundamental issue, in the current political environment is being very clear about and getting, alignment from the way legal arguments are made and the way, policy is written on tribes as political entities and as sovereigns, and the constitutional roots of all of that, which, most Americans don't sort of appreciate, but is fundamental to not only American Indian law, but our constitutional order. And if we can maintain those legal principles of tribes as sovereign political entities, then I think tribes are better positioned not only to deal with changes in administration, et cetera, but to realize in a more meaningful way, like genuine self-determination and sovereignty. And so that is my number one worry, that there may be some, ideological efforts to erode tribes' status as political entities, as opposed to, demographic or racial classifications. And so as I think about, the future for Indian country, in my mind, like everything kind of flows from that, and taking this moment to reinforce the constitutional and legal underpinnings for that political relationship.
Thank you, Tommy.